All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast, a member of the BQN Podcast Network. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on X, formerly known as Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @TrekBookClub on Twitter. Before we start the conversation, I would like to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, if you would like to help us keep our shows coming to you, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can join our monthly Star Trek scripts table reads and enjoy our special patron-only shows of It's Green and Amy's Math Moments. Visit patreon.com/BQN to get all the details. If becoming a patron isn't your thing, you can still support the show by subscribing to our podcasts, sharing our posts on social media, or leaving us a rating or written review. Thank you for your support. For this episode, we will be talking about the TOS novel, The Lost Years by J.M. Dillard, which was published in 1989 and was the book club's discussion novel for April 2024. We are recording after the release of the 20 Prodigy Season 2 episodes. So this is a warning that we will discuss spoilers related to The Lost Years and may also touch upon other episodes and novels in the Star Trek franchise. To help me discuss this novel, we have Trek Book Club member Michael Romero joining me today. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the pod, and thanks for joining me to talk about The Lost Years.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm glad I could join in today.
Yeah. We asked our first-time guests to give their Trek origin story and their Trek novel origin story. So can you start us off with your Trek and Trek book origin story?
All right, I'll do my best for you. My Trek origin story, I'm going to go way back, right around 1986. My father was active duty U.S. Army, and he actually went on a 2-year tour to South Korea. So I ended up going to kindergarten in Seoul. And of course, we missed a lot of the American television programming. And one of the things we were sent was from my grandmother. She actually sent us a VHS tape where she had recorded the original Star Trek series episodes, Shore Leave and Arena. So I got to watch both of those in Korea. We came back. It was right about 87, 88. They were starting to gear up for the Olympics there. So we got back to Virginia just in time for Star Trek The Next Generation to come out. So I watched the first few episodes. By the time Deep Space Nine came out around 91, 92, I was soaked in actively watching, and I've been a fan ever since. I've seen just about every Star Trek episode and movie, except for the new Prodigy episodes, which I'm going to start on with my kids tonight. But for Trek novels, I think this one, The Lost Years, was one of the first ones I read. Of course, I was about 10 or 12 years old. So a lot of it went over my head. It wasn't until I was about 14 or 15 that it actually hooked me. But also a big fan of the Next Generation novels by Peter David and Michael Jan Friedman. In fact, I think I found you guys on Twitter. I saw references to Mike Friedman's book, Requiem, where Captain Picard goes back in time, Cestus 3 and all of that. And that sort of hooked me. But
You mentioned about Shore Leave and Arena. Those were pretty classic TOS episodes, very memorable ones, with Shore Leave having that location shooting, and then Arena as well having something similar with the Gorn. So, and then you mentioned Requiem. The book club did discuss that. I think it was at the end of 23. So we did discuss that recently. Yeah, and that was really good. I enjoyed that book. We've discussed several of Peter David's books on the club with, I remember, Imzadi and Vendetta.
Vendetta was a really good one. Called back to several original series episodes, if I remember right.
I think it was a Doomsday Machine and the Borg, at least starters. So those were good. Great. And I hope you get a chance to watch Prodigy. I'm a little bit behind on season 2 myself. I'm only up to episode 3 or something like that. So
I've heard a lot of good things about this one so far. My youngest, she's about 14 right now. She's mainly concerned with the little location that you saw on the mining planet in season 1. Will they be back? Like, I don't know if they rescued the rest of them, but so she may or may not be as enthusiastic this year.
Like you said, I've heard positive feedback on
Yeah,
season 2, and I hope they'll be able to continue the show. You never know, but I hope they'll be able to continue
I hope so.
for future.
Netflix has been known to do that before, keep shows going that other channels have canceled.
Okay, great. Thanks. So now we'll talk a little bit about Lost Years, and
Okay.
I'll start off with the description of the novel. After the end of the Enterprise 5-year mission, Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, and Dr. McCoy struggle to establish new lives apart from each other and the starship. The newly promoted Admiral Kirk is placed in charge of a specially created Starfleet division and attempts to defuse a critical hostage situation. Mr. Spock, who, in the midst of a teaching assignment on Vulcan, finds the one thing he least expected, and Dr. McCoy, whose unerring instinct for trouble lands him smack in the middle of an incident which could trigger an interstellar bloodbath. Okay, so what were your initial impressions of the Lost Years, and what did you think about the books on a more general basis?
I really enjoyed this one. Of course, I mainly looked at it because, like everyone else, I was curious what happened between the end of the original series and the start of the motion picture. So even as a young one, between 10 and 12, even to 14 years old, it was telling a part of the story that I was really interested in. And we were talking earlier before the recording started about how the ancient Vulcan storyline really hooked you with the Zakal and Sakaar and the old mine lords of Kolinar. For some reason, that really captivated me. It wasn't long after that my older brother got me into sword and sorcery type fantasy novels. So maybe that whole idea of Star Trek wizards opened something up. Yeah, and this is one of the first Star Trek authors I wrote. We're familiar with McCoy and Kirk and all of that, but she gave us characters that were easy to get invested in. So you want to keep reading this book.
Yeah, I agree. I, also enjoyed it. That era between TOS and TMP hasn't been explored a whole lot. So this was a good way of diving into that and learning about the transition. And I'm sure we'll talk about as the book sets up what we saw in TMP, but we don't really exactly know what led up to some of those decisions. So I think this was a book that covers it well. I saw the book as 2 halves. The first section of the book focused on the return of the Enterprise, the transition of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy to their lives post 5-year mission. And then the Kirk with the Admiralty, which will be one of the main themes of that first half of the book. And then the second half of the book was focusing on the missions themselves, the 2 missions, the Kirk and Admiral Siana with the Inari and the Janai.
Yeah.
And then the Spock, McCoy, Carrie Dwen, which is one of the characters you alluded to that was developed and had a lot of background in the book for her, focusing on the Vulcan Kolinar masters and the threats from them. So it actually reminded me, I don't know if you read the Voyager relaunch novels. There was a book.
Homecoming.
Homecoming.
I remember reading that.
Yeah, exactly. That was a 2-parter, Homecoming and then The Farther Shore. And this book actually reminded me a little of Homecoming in that similar setup. Homecoming picks up right after Endgame, after the Voyager finale. So one thing about the finale on screen, we never saw what happened once they arrived. We just ended right there. So Homecoming picks that up, talks about how they arrived back at Starfleet, back at Earth, how the Voyager crew adjusted, where their lives take them, and then they continue on the mission.
Right,
of the
absolutely.
story. So this reminded me of that type of structure. Let's talk about that first half of the book. You mentioned the prologue, which I found interesting, took place thousands of years ago, and we meet some of those characters, Zakal and Kotet, and meet the characters which they'll be returning at the end. I found that to be an interesting prologue. Sometimes Trek books do that. It starts off in the distance past, and then they connect to it back. So I found that was a good setup, and it makes sense later on once those characters came back. Yeah. And then the transition to the return of the Enterprise. So we get the whole sequence of the Enterprise coming back, Kirk wanting to be the captain of the Victorious, which I think was the ship that he wanted. So he wanted to continue being.
If I remember right, like the Victorious assignment was expected to be relatively short term. That would be concluding just as the Enterprise was coming out of refit, so he could come back to the job he really wanted, something like that.
That would have been his ideal situation, just having a short-term captain assignment and still be captain and then get ready for the return of the Enterprise in TMP, which we saw. And then Spock, he had a choice, taking the captaincy of the USS Grissom, which was a nice connection to the search for Spock, which is when we saw
which I think Kirk had recommended him for or something like that.
The other choice was to work at the Vulcan Science Academy, being an instructor.
And I think even Starfleet was offering him a teaching position at Starfleet Academy, setting up the way we see him in Wrath of Khan in the very beginning. So either way, Starfleet is offering him a promotion and challenging assignments, and Vulcan is inviting him back home.
Yeah. So Spock had a pick of different things. And then McCoy, there was a section in which he was trying to convince Nagura to not have Kirk be an admiral. McCoy was advocating for Kirk to be a captain, which is best destiny, as they say. So he was trying to do that. And then he was going to Fabrini from the TOS episode.
Yes.
For the world is hollow and I have touched the sky. That's one of my favorite Star Trek episode titles, but that didn't work out.
And like you see it fairly quickly. The novel is pretty hefty to begin with, but I remember the first time we read it, of course I was like 12, but I was surprised we didn't actually get to see the meeting between McCoy and Natira as much as he had hyped that up. That was going to be his next chapter. I suppose there are only so many subplots you can put in a book like this.
It would have been nice. In TOS, we didn't have a whole lot of McCoy-centric episodes. That's the one that jumped to my mind when it comes to a McCoy-focused episode. He played critical roles in several of the other episodes, but when it comes to a McCoy-centric episode for The World is Hollow, was really the only one I thought of.
And the reason why the relationship didn't work out, where Natira, she had a limited time before she had to accept a suitor, resolve her role as the high priestess and things like that. It's been a while since I've seen For the World is Hollow, but that seemed in character with what they established.
One thing that I hope we could have gotten a bit more of, but didn't, was the other characters, the other TOS Enterprise crews. Scotty and Uhura had a few scenes. Uhura a little bit more later on in the book. Scotty, I think he was in the beginning for a little bit. I don't even think Sulu and Chekhov, they were mentioned, but I don't even think they had anything.
They were done almost immediately.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book. The only thing I would have wanted was a little bit more character about the other crew. I understand why. I think the focus was on the Triumvirate.
And something else I should point out, Dillard mentioned this in her author's note at the beginning. Lost Years was intended to be the first book in a short run series, taking it the whole time. And I think it was the third book, Traitor Winds, was a little bit more Chekhov-centric. At the end of the original series, he's the ship's navigator. By the time we get to the motion picture, he's the tactical and security officer because we have Ilea as the new navigator. But that third book shows him in that transition period where he's going through the added training. Of course, that's required for him to get his promotion to the next level and things like that. But maybe that's why she felt like she didn't need to pay as much attention to some of these characters because they already had at least some idea of the threads they'd follow in the next few books. But
that's a good point. Thanks for the clarification. So that makes sense. They probably, when all the various authors was strategizing on how to map out those character arcs, they decided which characters to focus on. Because it is the first book of the series to focus on the three leads that we know. One character I was pleasantly surprised to see a return of is Kevin Thomas Riley. So that was a nice little surprise. Kirk promoted him, the chief of staff, or
right. After he transferred off the Enterprise, I think he was somewhere else, and he led an away team, and someone was killed, and so he's like, I don't want to be out in space to the whole teaching thing. But you got to see him develop a little bit more. And I remember reading somewhere that they'd originally intended Riley to be more of a recurring character in the original series, but maybe something like actor availability or something pulled him away. You actually had pretty meaty scenes in the 2 episodes he was in.
You're right. I really enjoyed his appearances. He was the Naked Time when he was infected by that virus. That was more of a comedic version of Riley. And
then of course, you have Conscience of the King, where you hear about the backstory about his parents. And supposedly young Kirk was the one that actually rescued him from a lot of that. But I don't remember if they mentioned that in the episode. That scene gets played out in another one of the books, I think. But sort of the shared cast between them, that definitely sounds like something they would have continued to work with if the actor had stayed around.
Yeah. You mentioned about the actor. I read somewhere that the Conscience of the King originally, it wasn't Riley, but the actor who played Riley got the part, but it was some other character. And then one of the crew on the show remembered it was the same actor that had earlier character.
Yeah.
So they changed it to Riley, and now we have a little backstory into his life and background.
Get a chance for development that a background character normally wouldn't get.
In the Lost Years, he had some good scenes. Given what happened on the away mission, he started to doubt himself and lack confidence to be the chief of staff. So it was a nice way of developing character even more from what we saw in TOS.
It gives you a good look into Lori Siana's character as well. When Riley was thinking about quitting the second day on the job, and she hears into him when Kirk's away, it says, you're going to make him look bad if you did this. He had to argue with Nagura to get you promoted in the first place, and now you want to do this. So you see how she cares about people. I don't know if tough love is quite the right word, because she was genuinely angry with him, but she was doing it to motivate him. And of course, at the very end, when they come back together, she's happy that he's made the decision. He's resolved enough to keep going forward.
Let's talk about a couple of the newer characters that was introduced in the book. You mentioned Admiral Lori Siani. So she was Kirk's boss when Kirk accepted the Admiralty and worked on that diplomatic mission. What did you think of her character?
I thought she was really interesting too. At first, it seemed like she's not the nicest character. She openly admits that she's using Kirk to get what she wants. But rather than just using him, she's actually open about it. Like, yes, I need you because I need your experience to promote me. But I'm going to tell you that right off the bat. And since you're helping me, I'm going to use my influence later on to benefit you a little bit later. But at first, it seems like she admits that she has her own agenda for wanting Kirk in the position, but she's not just going to use him and cast him aside. It's sort of a high-performing, help me out and I'll help you out later on. I thought that was both a real moment. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with wanting to further your own career. That's pretty natural for most anyone. But there are some people that would just use their colleagues and cast them aside. And they'd probably be praised for doing so in a way. But I think it speaks something to her underlying character that she just didn't want to use Kirk and throw him away and not care what happens after that.
Yeah. I like how she was trying to convince Nagura that she wanted to get promoted or move up the ladder. And then Nagura was trying to mentor her, tell her how she can improve and how Kirk can help her do that. So that was good development on her side. A little bit of a semi-tangent, but one thing I didn't realize is that her character showed up in TMP. She was in the transporter accident.
I remember hearing that. That was in the novelization that Gene Roddenberry wrote.
Yeah, I think it was in the novel. So it wasn't like official because her name wasn't mentioned on screen, but what I recall in the novelization of TMP, she was one of the two. I think the Vulcan commander.
Yes, Sonak, the one that was going to fill Spock's role.
So he was the other victim of the transporter, and then Admiral Siani.
I don't know if I'd like it being official in the movie, because apparently, according to the novelization, that's another thread they flesh out in future Lost Years novels. She and Kirk end up married for something like a very short time, one of those 1-year marriage contracts that they mentioned Riley having in the book. But something like that. But then Kirk's sort of, I don't know if blasé is the right word. So the quiet, okay, they're dead, we're moving on. If that's really his wife, I think we would have seen, even an ex-wife, we would have seen some sort of a reaction.
Some more.
Introducing her in the Lost Years, if she promised to do everything she could to get Kirk the Enterprise back, it makes sense she would come aboard to see him off in that moment. So it makes sense that she would be there, just with the way the sync was filmed. I don't know if that's the best connection.
Yeah, it was interesting how they connected these little threads. And then the other main character that we meet was Peregrine Llewellyn, who is, for me, one of the more developed characters that appeared at one time. So we get a chance to learn a lot about her and her background and her ESP, her skills with the tarot cards. And then she plays a critical role towards the end.
She was really interesting. I don't necessarily want to jump to the end. That's where you have some of her really great moments. And of course, some of it is a little bit of book hand wavium that you get in television episodes and such too, where it turns out she was destined to be in that moment for that particular reason. And finally, all the suffering she went through with predicting everyone else's death and being able to do nothing about it was a really good moment of catharsis for her, because even though she ends up sacrificing herself, out of everyone else she had to watch die and couldn't do anything about it because she did what she did, she knew that Spock and McCoy would end up being okay. And just the comfort that gave her out of the lifetime of all of those experiences, I thought that was really profound.
Even though we didn't see her a lot, her affection for McCoy and friendship for Spock came through. So felt that even though they didn't know each other for a long period of time, she still had feelings for them. Yeah.
When as close as a relationship she was forming with McCoy, it makes sense that there would sort of be a soft spot for Spock, conceivably even Kirk, if they'd had the opportunity to interact more. Someone that important to a person she cares about, you can't really ignore him.
For that first half, we'll talk about Kirk and Managora trying to get him to be an admiral. That was a big chunk of that, especially in the Wrath of Khan and the Voyage Home, and when Kirk realizes he was meant to be a captain and not an admiral, but at this point in time, he was really considering, and he accepted the admiral position. And so Managora trying to convince with Lord Siani's help, but McCoy and Spock was trying to convince him. So that whole section was interesting because that helped develop the Kirk character that we will see that thread continue in the movies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting moments I thought is Spock was originally holding off on his decision to see what Kirk did, because I think he was expecting Kirk to not take the Admiralty position, maybe end up having a miracle and getting command of the Victorious, and then Spock could serve with him again. It wasn't until Kirk accepted promotion to the Admiralty that Spock decided, well, maybe I should take the position on Vulcan myself. And I thought that was an interesting moment where Kirk and Spock talk to each other about it. They basically do the thing, says, well, I want to do what's best for your career by having you promoted to captain. And he's like, that's not where I'll be happiest. Wouldn't accepting a promotion to admiral be better for your career? And Kirk's like, well, that's not where I'm happiest. And so they kind of see what the other one is saying. They just end up at different points. And that's really one of the good things about the Kirk and Spock relationship, is they can serve as that sort of foil and alternative viewpoint for each other.
I'll read a short passage related to with Nagura, talking about Nagura trying to convince him to accept the Admiralty. This comes from page 55 of the ebook version of The Lost Years. So start with Nagura. I wouldn't have put your assignment request on hold if I didn't desperately need you. What is it about commanding a ship that you find so rewarding? Kirk replied, the chance to travel, to explore, to not be chained to the desk, to be where things are happening, to be able to command. Nagura, an admiral command more than a captain. A captain commands one ship, an admiral can command a fleet. Kirk, it's not the same. Commanding long distance isn't the same as being there. Being able to see the immediate effects your orders have. It's far more rewarding to be captain. That sums up Kirk's view of being an admiral, being a captain. And Nagura is another character we heard of in TMP, but I don't think we actually saw, and became used pretty frequently in novels from that era.
He popped up in a couple of the comic books throughout the 80s, things like that.
So he's been that go-to admiral for that era of Star Trek. I was reading the Star Trek Vanguard novels, which takes place in the TOS, and so Nagura pops up in some of those stories as well.
And it also sets up what Kirk ends up telling Picard in Star Trek Generations: don't let them do anything that'll get you out of the command chair, because that's where you can make a difference. I think the book, if it was written in 89, he's saying something similar, technically non-canon, I'm making air quotes, version that ends up being fleshed out on screen about 5 years after that.
That's a good point. I forgot exactly where people joined Starfleet to be captains, not to be commanders, not to be admirals. There might have been a quote from one of the shows, but
it might have been something. And there is even the first of the reboot movies where Pike was telling Kirk, when he just gotten his butt handed to him in the bar fight, that you can be captain of a starship in something like 8 years or something like that. And talking about the effect that a Federation starship captain can have on the world around him. And then there's a lot of potential in that position, at least with the way Starfleet's written.
Later on in Wrath of Khan, McCoy and Spock told Kirk that, you shouldn't have accepted the Admiralty. And they did it in their unique McCoy and Spock way. So McCoy was more emotional and Spock was calm, and that this was
logical
as usual, but he was still getting the same point across. So,
And even when Kirk had to take command back from Spock, the Spock openly said it, I'm only in command because I'm a teacher. I don't aspire to command. Whereas that's what you were made for.
Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, one of my favorite Trek movies. And that ending scene when he was referred to by the Federation president as Captain Kirk, or the only punishment, we're going to demote you from Admiral to Captain, your ship back.
They give you the assignment for which you've always shown unswerving ability, I think it was. One of the things that I think is interesting about all of that, in Star Trek II, even after Kirk takes command, like there's the whole thing, he's getting old and senile, let's trick him. He's been an admiral for long enough. He's kind of forgotten what it's like to be in that captain's chair. But in Star Trek VI, even in Star Trek V, as flawed as arguably as that movie was, Kirk is a straight up captain again. And you can see he's much more comfortable in that role than you saw him in Star Trek II, because he's back where he belongs.
Captain
Sets
Mission,
up like a couple of weeks after or something like that. Let's see what she's got. And you find out the ship starts falling apart. But I think one of the greatest Captain Kirk moments, at least for me, was in Star Trek V, where he's getting that mission briefing. He's like, the ship's in pieces. We're in no condition to go out. Is there really no other ship that can do this? And the Admiral says, we need plenty of ships, but we need James Kirk. And you hear Shatner in the background, oh, please.
I have to watch out for that. I haven't seen that in ages.
It's worth watching again for character moments. A lot of Next Generation fans say Insurrection was the weaker of the Next Generation movies. I don't agree with that myself, but both Insurrection and Star Trek V, at least for me, had some of the best character moments for their individual crews. And you can see them sort of exploring how all of that goes together.
I think you're right. For Star Trek V, that Kirk, Spock, McCoy friendship that we saw in TOS a lot came through the most. I think Insurrection is similar, in which between Picard and Riker and Deanna knowing their relationship and having those character moments.
And it had one of the best Picard scenes, I think, ever. When the Admiral's saying we're only talking about 600 people and Picard comes back with how many people does it take before it becomes wrong? In a way that only Patrick Stewart can deliver. It wasn't loud. He just does this little slight head tilt before it was wrong.
So Kirk accepts the Admiralty and Spock accepts the Vulcan Science Academy. And then it hit me that, I'm glad he wasn't part of the Grissom. It's like, that's not going to end well.
Question, though. If he was the Grissom captain, he wouldn't have died in Star Trek II. So like all sorts of things could have happened. But if the Klingons came after Genesis and Spock was captain of the Grissom, would that situation have played out differently? Because they gave Esteban in 3 the idea of the indecisive, out of his depth, unwilling to take risks. I feel like Spock would have handled it differently. It still may not have worked out especially well, but interesting questions there.
Yeah, it's more like a what if scenario. What would have happened? Spock accepted that captain instead of Captain Esteban. It would have been total. But like you said, the whole what happened in the Wrath of Khan could have been different too if Spock wasn't on the Enterprise and was on Grissom. And then McCoy resigned from Starfleet, so he
ends up tagging along with Dwayne for the lecture tour because that's where they met. Yeah, because I think the Vulcan was supposed to be their last lecture stop. And he's like, I'll just go off by myself and mope for a little while. And he ends up getting sucked up in everything else.
Just getting into trouble. Wrong place at the wrong time. I remember there was that part, and it was too hot in Vulcan. So he went to the shuttlecraft bed. And then
because he could turn on the air conditioner and everything.
When I was reading that section, I was like, I could see where this is going. And it's going to get kidnapped. And then everyone's going to try to find him.
I did think it was funny that the first thing Sicard does when he's got the calls copter in his head, they get in the shuttle, says, why is it so cold? And he just fixes everything, and then they take off.
So that was the first half. And then the second half, it was these missions. We could talk about the diplomatic one first. So there was the Jani and the Inari, and it was Kirk and Siani's mission to try to get them to come to agreement.
It was almost a United Nations kind of thing where they had a peacekeeping force that could have been used. But if you send in the peacekeepers, that's when you're suppressing the rebellion almost by force. It's bad enough. It's no longer profitable. They have an ambassador that monitors 4 other systems or something odd. So it's either send the troops in or find some other way to work the problem out. And that was the point of Kirk and Siana as their troubleshooters, the last ditch effort. before we have to do the violence.
And then there was some subterfuge by the Nari. They were trying to get Kirk injured.
They're still attacking and blowing things up, but the Inari just want them just swept under the table. If they end up talking to the other side, the Inari realize they may have to give something up. God forbid they compromise. They're seeking an advantage. Like, we're more technologically advanced. You're used to dealing with people like us. You don't really want to talk to these guys. And in the end, the solution turns out to be something simple. All of the factories and the stuff that the Johnai, the terrorists are objecting to, you can move that to the planet Inar, the neighboring one. You can enclose all of that in a way you can't do. The Inari consider themselves Johnai, so it's their home planet, but move the industry away from the nature that the other side wants to preserve, and they're happy. And it all involved someone had to be willing to listen to what the other side wanted rather than just sending in the Marines, as it were.
It was actually around then. There was a Uhura and Sarek short little section because they got kidnapped. The diplomat.
To sort of get Starfleet's attention, the Inari won't let us talk to anybody. And then now you have to pay attention to us because we got this guy. A lot of it was as bad as it was because there was the mysterious Romulan in the background sort of stirring things up as they do.
Stirring, as Romulans tend to do over the course of the decade.
Which is going to be somewhat related to when we talk about Serpents Among the Ruins.
That's a Lost Era book, so with Captain Harriman. I'm looking forward to that. Harriman was more like a comedic character, to the detriment of him. I'm sure, as a captain of an Enterprise, I'm sure they don't give those around to any captains. In Generations, he was a little bit more comedic, and so I'm hoping.
And that was another one. I think I mentioned it on the X or the Twitter page, whichever one we call it. An earlier book by Peter David called The Captain's Daughter gives you a little bit more of Harriman's perspective. Of course, it's another Enterprise B story, which after the movie came out, everyone was like, wait a minute, what happens to that crew? And so Peter David wrote a story about them, and you get the idea that Harriman in Generation, it was all this big media circus. All right, we're going to put you out, like the ship's not ready, you're just going to go around. And of course, as usual, when the Enterprise is involved, something happens. And I thought it was funny. They're the only ship within 3 light years of Earth, the capital of the Federation. People. But yeah, it was media circus. Yes, the ship's only half together. You're not going to need to do anything with it. Not only does Captain Kirk die on his watch, all of the reporters are aboard to see it happen. David's book was how he recovered from that. And actually showed some of his grit as a captain, showing why he deserved to be on the Enterprise in the first place, which I thought was good. Kirkman's is set something like a good 15 years after the opening scene of Generation. So by this time, Harriman is not just a new captain, he's actually seasoned and experienced.
Coincidentally, when we were talking about Harriman, I just finished the book called Star Trek Enterprise Logs, which is a anthology book of various captains of ships named Enterprise. So it has 2 pre-Starfleet ships. They actually had the Revolutionary War. There was a ship Enterprise. So they had that. And then there was the World War II aircraft carrier Enterprise.
Oh, that would have been good. Yeah.
It was interesting to read that. I wasn't familiar with the Revolutionary War era, the verbiage and the words that they use.
I'd be pretty comfortable with that. I'll have to look that one up, actually.
Yeah. It's called Star Trek Enterprise Logs.
Okay, I'll definitely have to get that one.
One of my favorite short stories from that book was the one with Harriman. It's pretty good. And it talks about an older Harriman as well. And it talks about his experience on Generations and how he's adjusted and adapted to that.
Yeah.
And there was various surprises and twists as well. And I really enjoyed that short story with Harriman. So I'm looking forward to reading Serpents Among the Ruins. That'll probably be my next book.
I felt kind of bad because I hyped it up into the bowl. The other guy's been wanting to get the Final Reflections read, which is another one of my favorites.
The other mission was McCoy, Spock, and Dwen ended up on Vulcan in the Gull Monastery.
The lecture tour was over.
Yeah.
Spock was telling her about the Mind Lords, oddly enough. Since she's interested in ancient religions and things like that, she wanted to go study the monks. And this happened to be followed. McCoy just wanted to go be by himself. So you get McCoy being cranky a little bit. That's the interesting part about it. Sakara goes off and steals Zakal's Katra. I think they called it the Mind Tree or something like that. The High Master summons all the Vulcans. And Cara Dwyn, just being an anthropologist, she sees all these Vulcans going out the hall in the middle of the night. She decides to follow them. And of course, she finds out that it's her ship that's been stolen. and her would-be boyfriend's been kidnapped. What are we going to do now? The books describe McCoy's unerring instinct for trouble. I honestly think that belongs more to Cara Dwyn because she just sort of jumps, and then just by providence, I guess, she has the one ability where she's completely, a Esper blind, no telepathic center whatsoever. So she's probably the one person to call cannot affect from afar. So she could actually be vital in helping get everything back.
Yeah, she played a very critical role in defeating him. And I think that whole tarot card scene helped set her character up because of the skills that she had, but being that Esper.
That was the whole idea. She had the premonition about either McCoy or Spock were going to die. Where she doesn't want to tell them because they won't believe her, but it reminds her of all the earlier trauma she's had with her family and friends.
Somewhere around this time, they ended up in Arcturus because it's almost like a little bit of a side mission.
So they had to get their cloaking device so they could go and sneak into the Romulans.
There was also Tasai, which was the Vulcan master.
Of course, you don't find out until the end of the novel she's brought Kotet's spirit with her. Because you need a Mind Lord to beat a Mind Lord.
So she was there. And there was also Tessura, Spock's potential mate.
I thought it was an interesting part because you see things throughout the original series. You hear repeatedly how, I don't know if discriminated against is the right way to put it, but basically he was made to feel unwelcome on Vulcan. There was no place for him there. So he went off to Starfleet. And then after this 5-year mission, he comes back and there is a place for him on Vulcan. Even one of the people that abducted his pet, Selak, that ran one of these childhood pranks. And Spock finds out that the guy feels great shame that he stooped to this. And according to the guy that played the prank, Spock acted like any self-respecting Vulcan would. But it's the whole thing of coming back with sort of a new maturity. And Spock unexpectedly is finding life and fulfillment on Vulcan, including finding a wife after the whole T'Pring incident. Well, like in TMP, they had to get to the idea, why did Spock want to get rid of all of his emotion?
I think the author did a good job with setting up the characters. There's a few more books within the series before we get to TMP, but starting to put those hints into the characters that we'll see develop more. The next major scene was the finale in which there was a chase. Kirk and Sienna finished up the diplomatic mission.
They were just about to wrap it up. They were almost at an impasse when Zakal and McCoy beam into the Romulan base to do something. And then Kirk finds out what's going on. Then Zakal attacks one of the Jedi. And that just sort of gives the impetus for the diplomatic stuff to be resolved. And then Kirk can go run off after the Vulcans.
Dwyn slowly realizes what her role is in all this, that she could be like the one person that can defeat.
I think that's why they brought her along. If anyone else is the pilot, McCall can sense them and lead them off course and make them blow up their own ship. He wouldn't even know that Dwyn is there, but he can sense the other people that are with her. It makes it harder for him.
I'm going to read a short section, which is on page 373. And this is the climax. So Kotet is in Dwyn, Zakal is in Sokar. Getting them all mixed up a little bit.
That also helps set up one of the great jokes that Zakal makes. After all these years, you still haven't run out of S names.
It's a Vulcan name. So this is the climax of the battle between Dwyn and Zakal. She was glad, very glad. All the pain that came before with Michael, with her parents, with her grandparents, all that suffering was not wasted. It happened for a reason. Only one regret now, that she could not explain all this to Leonard and Spock. She wanted them to know that she was happy in this. She could only hope that the paths they choose from this point led to good. Dwyn let Sotek speak to Zakal. And how fortunate that my promise to you in that regard has been fulfilled. I saved you once. I shall not do so twice. Taste my magic, old man. And then the bridge dissolved into white brilliance.
It was actually one of my favorite parts when Carradine got those last words in.
I like that part as well. So that's why I wanted to mention it.
Yes.
Like I said before, she was one of the more memorable one-time characters in Trek novels. This sometimes comes across in the Trek Book Club discussions. The characters we're familiar with, it's easier to know them because we've seen them so many times. But characters that are introduced in the novels, it's a little bit of a hit or miss. Sometimes we are
Well,
interested.
and also
Like,
with some of those newer characters, the authors aren't necessarily constrained by what you've seen. Spock has to be this way because all of these shows and movies, same with Kirk or McCoy, but with an original character like Gwen or even Zakal and Sakar, you can introduce more unstable factors.
like you say, you're not restricted to canon or to what they've
Right.
seen on screen, so they can explore different things. Uh, what was your overall thoughts about the book?
A lot.
And- yeah.
It's hard to limit it to just a little bit. But one thing I think that this book did very well, there's the whole idea in the first half of the book where the Enterprise is coming home. There's like, oh, we'll all get together again. And then, of course, reading the book, we know, well, yes, we've got Star Trek and Star Trek 2 and 3. But at the end of this book, Spock is saying, I'm going to go become a monk. McCoy's out of the service. He doesn't know what he's going to do. Kirk's an admiral now. Even though we know better because of all of the movies, this book really gives a good sense that the crew is split up. I think it's really good at setting up that first chapter that this is the end of the original series right here.
That's a good point. I found this to be a good conclusion or wrap up of TOS, of the series themselves. And then they're not at TMP yet because, as you mentioned, you have a few more books and there's other journeys that they're going to go through. But it was a good first step on that transition to what we see in the movies. So I think the author did a good job on that. Some books have a closure or they end, but I think this book leave things up in the air because it's the first chapters of a longer journey. So Kirk is now an admiral, whether he's going to be successful or not, or whether he realized, we know what happens.
And it's actually the good point. His last scene with Riley in the office, he's come back from this mission, done all this stuff with the Vulcans, and he comes back. He looks comfortable as an admiral. So he's accepted, hey, this is what this position can offer. I think I can work with this.
Yeah. He got all the feedback. He evaluated everything that McCoy and Spock said, but he went ahead and accepted it and now have a next career.
Right.
And then Spock with Kulinar and starting his journey on that we'll see at the start of TMP. And then McCoy was interesting for me because in TMP, we knew a little bit of what happened, but we didn't really know the details.
Well, all we knew is that he was out. It's me has that great moment about the reserve activation clause, which means they drafted me, which I think would have probably come off a lot less funnier if I were watching it in 1979, not long after Vietnam and all of that. When all of those people that actually were. But yeah.
This book shows the emotional journey he had with Dwen and all the ups and downs, with the Tira and Dwen. And so this way we find out a little bit more about what happened. So, so that's the Lost Years.
It went by pretty quick, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Any closing thoughts about, or anything we didn't really cover yet?
Not really.
That we missed.
I think the only thing I would suggest to your listener, definitely read The Lost Years, but if it hooks you, consider picking up the next books in the series and continuing the journey. I think the final book in the Lost Year series, it ends with Spock going up the mountain in TMP to go meet with the High Master. That, of course, we know what happens and everything. But there's more story to be told in between the episodes and movies, and definitely check it out.
Okay, great. What I'll do is put the books that are part of that series in the show notes. So for any listeners who's interested in continuing,
maybe if we get enough attention, they'll show up in the Simon & Schuster ebook sale.
Well, actually, one thing I noticed with the last couple of months of Simon & Schuster ebook sale is the number of books is more than before. So it used to be 8 to 10 to 12 books. Last month, it was like 80 or something like that. A lot of the books are repeats, so they were on sale in months past or years past, so they brought them back.
There's a response, I guess.
Yeah. But there's some demand, and then this month, it was less than 80, but it was more than 10 or 12. It was somewhere around 25 or something like that.
Even still, 10 and 12 can be very dangerous for me if I have a little bit of disposable income. But now that they're doing 80, 99 cents adds up really quick.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I fall into that trap of I'm not sure if I'm going to read it, but for 99 cents or $1.99, I'll just buy it. And then before you know it, there'll be more. But I still buy it and I try to support that idea. And hopefully it continues to be successful. They'll expand it. So instead of repeats, they'll have new books that will be part of the sale. Or even repeats, because even if it's a repeat for me, it's not a repeat for fan that just started reading ebooks and they'll start picking those up. In closing, just wanted to thank you, Michael, for joining me on the podcast today and talking about the lost years. I remember you mentioned on Twitter that you really read this book a lot. And so I definitely wanted to get your views and opinions on this book. So I really
it's definitely a favorite.
Can you please let us know the best way for our listeners to contact you in case you want to continue the conversation? And also if there's any projects that you're working on that you'd like to share with your audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the best way to get a hold of me is on X or Twitter. I am at Mr. Alligator CW, based off of a name I picked up working at Colonial Williamsburg for a while, which is a long story. But other than that, I'm a high school history teacher right now, also a big Age of Sail history nerd. I've been writing book reviews for the Navy War College recently. I've been publishing articles of my own. In about another month, a friend and I are looking to have one of our final meetings. We're going to start a naval history podcast. So hopefully within another couple of months, we'll have some episodes of our own to share. It's tentatively called Jack Tars and Blue Jackets, but we'll see if the name ends up changing between now and the middle of August. But yeah, that's basically what I've got going on right now, trying to get as much independent research done as I can before the school year starts up, and I have to dive back into all of that. But either way, it should be good.
Can you say what the podcast is about, or it's to be determined?
It's going to mostly be about Age of Sail history, just following what I do. I tend to focus on American and British naval history between 1740 and 1850, thereabout. So a lot of it will be lesser known aspects of that history. Every once in a while, I might talk about new books that have come out, might talk about new and older movies that relate to the subject. And we'll probably have our share of tangents. I know you were talking earlier before we started recording, interested in World War II and things like that. Every once in a while, we'll branch out. So it's mostly going to be Age of Sail naval history with a little bit more thrown in every now and again, maybe some related science fiction every once in a while.
Definitely be interested in learning more and listening to that show. Check out Mike's Twitter profile with the links because you have your publications and the works that
reminds me I need to update that page again. But yeah, at Mr. Alligator CW, you can get in touch with me. The basic list of my publications is there. And of course, you can just get on my page, talk about Star Trek too. So and Star Trek also, more than just Star Trek too.
Yes. Well, thank you. Okay. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah. For me, you can reach me. I'm on Twitter as well. I'm at PeterTrek1, the number 1. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm also on Mastodon under the handle at PeterTrek1 at universeodon.com. You can also check out the Trek Book Club, which is on Twitter under the handle at Trek Book Club, where we read Star Trek books, including The Lost Years, and we discuss them approximately once every 6 weeks over a weekend. As mentioned at the start of this episode, the Trek Book Club podcast is part of the BQN Podcast Network. Here is a summary from Amy of the various podcasts which are part of this network.
What shows are on BQN, you ask? Well, here's a rundown of some podcasts you might be interested in. All Good Things, a Star Trek Universe podcast covering all of Trek, hosted by Amy, Mark, Christos, Kelvin, and Kristen. Whether you've got Xbox or Nintendo, check out Bargain Bin Gamer, a YouTube show hosted by Davey, a self-proclaimed gamer who specializes in reviewing and showcasing affordable video games. 2 episodes enter the arena, 1 comes out victorious. Join hosts Joe and Kevin and a guest as they debate which should win the Batleth battle. Grab your popcorn as you listen to Cinema Z, a film discussion and review podcast showcasing films you probably missed, but should definitely check out. Hosted by Mark and Nat. Don your apron for The Food Replicator, where Matthew eats and drinks his way through the Star Trek cocktail and 3 cookbooks. Beam Aboard Galaxy Class, a Star Trek Next Generation podcast covering all of TNG, hosted by Steven. In order to not repeat it, listen to History with the Zalogis, a snippet of historical events from around the world, hosted by Chrissy and Jason. For the newest Trek coverage, check out Infinite Diversity, hosted by Chrissy and Thad. Curl up with a good book and delve into Beta Canon with Peter, host of the online Trek Book Club on Twitter, and his new companion, Trek Book Club podcast. Test your Trek knowledge with Treksperts Quiz, a Star Trek quiz show hosted and written by Davey. Whether you're a member of Starfleet Federation or Planetary Union, go check out Union Federation, covering current Star Trek and the Orville, which we all know is really a Trek show, hosted by Kyle, Kevin, Amy, and Peely. Head over to YouTube and watch The View Screen live on Sundays, your Trek-inspired talk show hosted by Kelvin and Amy, with Season 2 starting in September for a 10-week run. Spill the tea with Christos while he discusses current Trek news and events and explores the world of fandom via guest interviews, all with a LGBTQIA+ perspective on what's the tea about. And for our Patreon members, we have the Hive Mind with monthly script readings. Let's Fly, a Discovery reaction show. It's Green, a cornucopia of topics. Amy's Math Moments, a quick look at math moments in Star Trek. We know you have a choice of podcasts to choose from, and we thank you for listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you again, Mike, for joining. This is Peter signing off. Happy reading and live long and prosper.